Christians were first called part of the way. Does this remind you of anything that Jesus said? I am the way, the truth, and the life. So they were first called members of the way. Today, if you're part of the way, it's an occult. It's a cult group, the way. But they were first called members of the way. So Paul goes and he gets this letter from the high priest, and he goes to Damascus, and he thinks he's being religious. Man, he is doing what he believes the Old Testament is calling him to do. That these people who are part of the way have really co-opted Judaism and are changing what Judaism says. And that they're saying that this Jesus is God. That's blasphemy. So Paul gets this letter. Verse 2, so that he can go to Damascus, that if he finds anyone there who belongs to the way, men or women, he might take them as prisoners back to Jerusalem. The donkey got hit in the head by the farmer to get his attention. I get hit in the head with going through relationship struggles. How has God worked in your life? What are those times in your life that it's been a darkness and there's been the light of Jesus Christ? Again, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He also says, I am the light of the world. I am the light of the world. What we see here in verse 3, as Paul nears Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashes around him. You can go to the picture there, Scott. A light from heaven flashes around him. And he falls to the ground, and he heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? See, Paul had ambition. Paul had direction. He had a desire to serve God, but it was misdirected. Again, we have a lot of people, and maybe some of us today act religious, but it can be misdirected. The reality is Jesus wants us to have a relationship. And it's interesting here when Jesus comes to Saul and Jesus says, why do you persecute me? I mean, was Saul actually persecuting Jesus Christ himself? I mean, didn't Christ already go through the persecution, the beating, the taking the cross, dying on the cross, being buried? Wasn't Jesus already persecuted? But Christ equates the persecution of his people, the church, with himself. You notice that? I mean, it's something pretty important for us to grasp here. Saul is persecuting the church, the Christians. Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? When you and I take the name Christian, when we ask Christ within our life, we become part of that family of God. We become, as the word Christian means, little Christ. You ever think about that? We're little Christ. We may be the only Bible that some people read. We're little Christ. We're called to work within other people's lives through the power of God. So Jesus says to Saul, why are you persecuting me? By persecuting the church. And I wonder sometimes, even for you and I, we may have things going well in our life. Family may be doing well. Finances might be doing well. Your needs might be met. And it's like, why do we need to change? Paul is on the road. He believes he's serving Yahweh God. Why does he need to change? He's in religion, not relationship. He needs to take a step beyond the religion. So what we see here, Jesus Christ comes to Saul with the bright light. Another song, Blinded by the Light. Blinded by the light. Paul is blinded by the light. He's in darkness, and then there's light. And it says, Saul says, who are you, Lord? He doesn't know who Jesus is. Who are you, Lord? Jesus says, I am Jesus, the one whom you're persecuting. And Saul replied, Where Jesus replied, "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." And the men who were traveling there stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but they didn't see anything. Saul got up from the ground. He opened his eyes, but he could see nothing. Jesus Christ says, "I am the light of the world." But you see, when we live in our sin, we're blinded to that light. When we live in our religiosity, how's that for a big word? Religiosity, we're blinded. When we live doing things our own way, we're blinded. When we don't see the grace that God has for us in our life, and all we see is the pain that we're in, all we see is the cesspool that we're in, all we see is the struggles from relationships or finances or health or whatever, and if there's been a loss in our life, we see that pain and we're stuck there, and we're blinded. Don't you want to see the light? Don't you want to have that darkness lifted? Don't we want to have the joy of the Lord? The joy of the Lord is my strength. So says Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Don't we want that joy of the Lord for today, tomorrow, and for eternity? To see that there is a goodness in life. Paul, once he sees Jesus, is blinded. And I think this is very symbolic. Because he's been blinded in his sin. Jesus comes to him, and he's still blind. But how many days here? It says, it's interesting, that the people, the men that were with Saul, did not hear, they heard the noise, but they didn't know what was being said. So they took Paul up, verse 8, they led him by hand to Damascus. And for 3 days he was blind. For 3 days he did not eat or drink anything. That 3 have any significance? Maybe. Think about it. Christ died on the cross, and for 3 days he was buried. Paul, for 3 days, was blind. Time to think, time to do the interflection. There's, I know I quoted it a couple weeks ago, but a life unexamined is a life not worth living. Paul was examining his life. Paul was taking everything that he had learned as a Jewish leader and now putting it into being confronted by Jesus Christ. And trying to get those two gears to go together. Well, what's interesting here within the story of Saul is the fact that then, in verse 10, in Damascus there was a disciple named Ananias. And I think this is the only place in the New Testament that Ananias is talked about. The Lord said to Ananias, "Ananias," in a vision. Ananias says, "Yeah, Lord." The Lord said, "Hey, I want you to go to the house of Judas on Straight Street. Ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he's praying. In a vision, he has seen you, a man named Ananias, coming to him." So Saul, in the 3 days of his darkness, is seeing in his vision Ananias coming. And Ananias said, "Lord," paraphrase, "are you crazy? There is no way on God's green earth I am going to go to Straight Street to the house of Judas because Saul is a terrorist." Okay, put it in context. How many of us would actually want to invite the Muslim Brotherhood deposed president of Egypt, Mohammed Marcy? Thank you. I knew you'd get the names right, Michael. How many of us, if he became a Christian and he came over here to America, how many of us would say, "Hey, come here and talk"? We'd say, "Whoa, whoa." He's been part of some of this terrorism stuff, being part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of you thought I was crazy years ago when we were praying for the conversion of some of the Al-Qaeda leadership. Would we actually want somebody who had been a terrorist to come here? Would we want somebody who had been a terrorist who said they had become a Christian to come into our houses? Most of us might say, "Whoa, whoa, we're not going there." But Ananias says, he says, "Lord, you're crazy. Man, this man was a terrorist. This man killed Christians possibly. I'm not going to go there." But verse 15, the Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man is chosen to carry my name before Gentiles, kings, and I will show him how much he has to suffer for my name." And Ananias went to the house and entered it. How many of us